Buen día, estás escuchando Encuentros Políticos, listening to Political Encounters on Untitled Radio, a show focused on discussing political issues and taking action in Philadelphia's Latinx communities and beyond. I'm Edwin Mayorga, Ph.D. Today's show is focused on reopening Philly schools safely and justly. Tensions have run high as the school district of Philadelphia, like districts across the U.S., have been devising plans to reopen schools within the context of COVID-19. At last Thursday's school board meeting, district officials presented a proposal to reopen the city's schools using a hybrid plan. The plan was met with a flood of protests from teachers, principals, families, and youth community organizers. The school board tabled the issue, pushing the decision to this week. Then yesterday, the district announced the schools would remain online for all students at least through November. As this issue continues to unfold, the question remains, how do we reopen the schools in a way that is safe and just? To discuss this and related topics, I'm pleased to have Tamara Anderson and Dana Carter from the Racial Justice Organizing Committee, Lisa Haver from the Alliance for Philadelphia Public Schools, APS, and Kate Sannicks-Lerner from the PFP Caucus of Working Educators. Thank you all for joining us. I wanted to start actually, see who could tackle the question of what has COVID-19 taught us about the state of our schools now and before the pandemic began, just to give us a little bit of context for what's going on now.
I would love to speak to that and then give way to others if they have other ideas. But this was one of my biggest problems. The school district prior to the pandemic, we were already underfunded, under-resourced. I know that there have been state representatives who have blatantly said that they don't want to fund us because we have students who can't learn. And they specifically mentioned students of color. We are not funded equitably. Other people have resources that they can draw on from public tax coffers, and we do not. But the biggest thing that bothered me was when they were saying, well, we'll have class sizes of no more than 25, but it also said when feasible. And that's the part that bothers me, because decades of research have shown that smaller class sizes produce students who can read, students who are academically prepared. But for years, for decades, those same decades, the school district has been cramming students into those classrooms. And they know before the pandemic that was inequitable. And how can it be equitable now during the pandemic?
I think that's all very, very true. And it's not just the underfunding. What APS looks at is not just how the school district is governed, but how that governing body, whether it was the SRC before or the Board of Education now, how it spends the funds that it gets. And this week, actually, we have an agenda where we total up all the money that is being spent. And if you include the cost of the reopening plan, that's $190 million. So you're talking about over $100 million in spending. What is that being spent on? And we question those expenditures all the time. It's like outsourcing. And at least one of the items on this agenda is for professional development. Now, how is that even going to work? Is it all going to be remote? We don't know. But these are the things that deserve to be talked about. And most of the time, the board does not. They don't deliberate on most of the items. So we are spending money on things that, like if you just take all the money that has been outsourced just in the past 2 years since the board came in, we probably could have fixed a lot of the ventilation systems. That's just one example.
Dana or Tamara, did you have some thoughts?
Yes, I definitely think that first, good morning to everybody. Buenos días a todos personas que hablan español a la ciudad de Philadelphia.
Gracias.
Welcome to the show. I learned Spanish from my friend Kate Sannicks-Lerner over there. But yes, so I feel like what this COVID shutdown and this reopening plan really brought to light are the things that advocates have been saying in Philadelphia for years. There is a deficiency in how the school district of Philadelphia operates, and it starts at the administrative level and the board, and it just kind of trickled down to the operations as to what happens in the schools. So although this was completely what happened at the board meeting was we felt was completely disrespectful to the community. I thought it was extremely necessary for people to see really how the school district of Philadelphia operates. What happened last week was a microcosm of the school district of Philadelphia. So it's important for people to see why we need advocacy, why we need parent partners, why we need community partners, because we have been saying these same things for years in terms of the disparities that we see at our schools, and nobody really listens to us. So I welcome what happened as a result of that board meeting and as a result of the COVID shutdown. So I'm inspired by the advocacy I see in the community.
So I'm wondering then, or could anyone just give us a little rundown of last week's proposal and what your thoughts were on that, and then thinking about what the district has then issued in terms of their plan just yesterday.
Well, I think it is important to talk about the previous plan, which was a hybrid plan, which over 100 speakers pointed out all the ways that was not going to work. And now we have what we're told is a virtual plan. And, as Dana said, these meetings, well, it's one meeting, they broke it into two parts, really showed you a lot of the ways that people's trust in the district, let's just say, what wasn't increased last week. Because we saw that, for example, the board president was caught on a hot mic asking somebody, we have to assume Dr. Height, should we recess the meeting before we vote on anything? That really struck home for a lot of people. Like, well, this is supposed to be a public meeting. You have us looking at a white screen with a digital clock for 7 hours. And now we see that something's going on behind the scenes, which is not just a betrayal of the public, but it's a violation of the Pennsylvania Sunshine Act, which says people have to know exactly what's happening at a meeting and be able to participate. And it wasn't just that, there were a lot of indications that people were communicating in really what was a de facto executive session. And, there was no reason for the board not to vote on that full agenda with the 26 items and vote no on Dr. Height's plan. So why could they not vote on Dr. Height's plan and say no? What would have been so horrible about saying no? Because we're in the same position. He still has to come back with another plan. But keep in mind that the first plan was developed over months with some level of community engagement, not what we thought was a great level of community engagement, but there were surveys and there were quote unquote town halls, even though nobody answered any questions. Now we have this really outline of a plan released on Tuesday for a vote on Thursday. It's not reasonable to think that people can really explore what that plan is, in 2.5 days.
And additionally, with the original plan, I always use the word disingenuous, because it's very disingenuous to come to us and say, oh, this is the best and this is what we're going to do and it's for the kids, when they know very well that it's not. So one of the things that really bothered me, really concerned me, was the fact that they had Dr. Kellum and Dr. Fawley present information that went against almost every point the CDC made about reopening anything safely. much less a school. If a restaurant has to open at 25% capacity, you would think that a school would have to follow at least that same measurement. There were very few measurements given. This is a scientific effort, and they need to present and stick to the scientific data. Dr. Kellum presented two studies. One was done in Ireland when they reopened schools, or before they closed them. I wasn't really clear on that. And one was done in New South Wales, Australia. When she mentioned those studies, someone else said to her, but that's comparing apples to oranges, because the school district isn't a small section of Australia or Ireland, and those were very small studies. The Irish study was 1,155 people. The New South Wales was 863 people. In addition to that, the very important fact that contact tracing has to be done, those studies didn't do rigorous contact tracing, that's what I'll call it. They only traced symptomatic people. And as we know, the majority of people that contract this virus are asymptomatic. And that is why it is such a problem, and that's why it spreads. The study that was done in South Korea was presented to Dr. Kellum, and that study it's more representative of the district. There were almost 65,000 people in that study. They tested everyone that had the virus, their close contacts, like in their home, and anyone, whether symptomatic or asymptomatic, in the home and of the students and staff. The only people that they tested outside of those close contacts were people who were symptomatic. So even that study didn't gather all of the data, but it gathered much more than either of those two studies that Dr. Kellum presented. So I really resent that she used those two studies, because to me that kind of says, well, we know you guys aren't able to do that much digging, and you're not doctors, and you can't figure this out. So we're just going to tell you, and you're going to believe us because we're doctors. Doctors are human beings. And I think that they have an agenda. That's another reason why people don't trust the district.
I think just absolutely adding on to what Kate was saying, one of the other issues with that reopening plan, in my opinion, is that there is a particular, not issue, but the demographics of the teaching staff of the school district of Philadelphia pulls from the neighboring districts, right? So we have probably 25% of the teaching staff from Philadelphia who live in Montgomery, Delaware, in the surrounding counties. So why, if this reopening plan was going to be successful, why are we not consulting with the superintendents of the neighboring districts when you know that your teachers live in Montgomery County, they have children that go to Montgomery County schools, and if these two reopening plans don't align, it's going to cause pandemonium in the lives of teachers who have students who go to Montgomery County schools, but they work for the school district of Philadelphia. Now, if you want to have a conversation about the residency requirement for school district of Philadelphia teachers, that's another conversation. But as it stands now, the school district of Philadelphia teachers can live outside of the city of Philadelphia. And when that happens, and their children go to school in neighboring districts, that is going to create a problem that you have to acknowledge or you have to address when you have these reopening plans. But this particular reopening plan, Dr. Hite said it himself, that this reopening plan came with a budget of $60 to $80 million. So in my opinion, this is just my opinion, when you have the entire community, when you have elected officials, when you have doctors, when you have Dr. Fauci, when you have half of America telling you that schools cannot be open, schools will spread. You are saying that according to this reopening plan, the students will be in their classrooms for 5 hours and teachers will rotate in and out. And we know that COVID spreads more inside of a contained area. So tell me why their school board, is it this urge, Dr. Height and Wilkerson and Dancy? Is it this urge, Hinton, for you to reopen schools with this $60 million budget? I want to see who's going to benefit from these contracts. Because why else would it be that urge to open schools when you know it's going to cost $60 million? I want to see who's going to benefit from the contract. Who exactly was getting those contracts that totaled $60 million that, in my opinion, gave you a little bit more fire to try to open those schools when you heard 153 people tell you no?
Can I expand on what
go ahead, Lisa.
What Dana just said is that there were 3 expert presenters at on the agenda there. It was in addition to Dr. Height, who was selling his plan, we had Dr. Farley from the city's health department and his associate, Dr. Kelm, both telling us and the board why this plan was going to work. And then just that day, I think that morning, Scott Sowers from SEPTA was brought in, and his job again was to talk about how kids could get to school and they'd be, safe because we're cleaning the buses and we're cleaning the subways. And I said at the time, because I'm tweeting during the meeting, why is there nobody to talk about some of the problems with this plan? It's just seemed to be clear that it was set up to sell the plan with these expert, city officials, SEPTA officials. And then when you got to the end of that part of the meeting, it seemed to confirm what we were saying at the beginning, that were we supposed to get both sides of this issue? Or, as Dana said, and as I mentioned before, should we look at how much money is being spent and who is getting these contracts? You cannot not look at that. And the fact that Dr. Farley himself said something was the exact opposite hours before about inside dining. That no, inside dining, we can't. And he actually mentioned ventilation, whereas at the school board meeting, when ventilation came up, he's we're okay. Ventilation is relatively unimportant. Hours before had said the exact opposite, which is why APS is going to be calling on the mayor to ask Dr. Farley to resign. I mean, that is just reprehensible when you say, oh no, there shouldn't be any indoor dining because people will be somewhere for 45 minutes and there's not enough ventilation. But oh yeah, we could have kids in a classroom for 6 hours a day, eating in the classroom, people moving back and forth. Ventilation, it really, really showed you that our kids and our students didn't seem to be a priority for the city and the mayor's people.
Yeah, can I leap in really quick? I mean, for all these things, what I think what's interesting is that nobody listens to the state, which actually has the best information. And none of us should be listening probably to the CDC anymore because they just sent out a report saying that they rewrote their report to go with whatever the White House thought they should do. So there's a lot of information, but I do find, Dana put in a chat, the state doctor for PA, I'm always glued to whatever she says because I'm like, oh, these are like actual stats and data. For example, I'm really surprised that people aren't bringing up the South Korean study about the age group of 10 to 19-year-olds. And we're not talking about the increase of youth COVID positive cases in Florida that went from 14% to 23% in the last 2 weeks. And that just last week, a 9-year-old girl died from COVID-19 causes. So these are all, and on top of that, you had all summer instead of trying to think of what you wanted to make it, you had all summer to come up with an actual plan for our special ed students, for our students who can't wear masks, for our small students. But instead, we focused on, I mean, Lisa knows I feel this way. It's like, at the end of the day, you have to stop saying, are they doing this on purpose, or are they purposefully just like using their ignorance to willfully damage people? I think it's the latter, right? I think that, not to mention how many cases of teachers with pre-existing conditions. I have friends who teach with leukemia. I have friends who are teaching with first stages of cancer. I have teachers who have MS. I have teachers, teachers and nurses who who are survivors of strokes. There is a whole litany of things. And the fact, I know everybody saw that email where the district said, the district medical office literally told teachers, you can self-tell people, you can self-report what your pre-existing illness is. That sounds very questionable. Like, if you tell us, then we're going to tell you back to work, or have you signed some weird form. Also, too, the schools themselves. So unlike most states where schools have actually been rebuilt, even in places where they don't give you a lot of money, I've always found it very ironic that Philadelphia schools are literally almost as old as George Washington. Like, the boilers in some of the rooms are at 100, 120 degrees. You have some classrooms that are adjacent to the restrooms where the teachers will say, I smell urine all the time. So if we can't take care of basic cleanliness, why in the world do you think a pandemic type of clean is going to happen? Not to mention, I have talked to engineers at like schools, I won't mention the schools, I won't get them in trouble, but I've talked to some engineers at various high schools who just had new HVACs put in, maybe the last 3 years. And they told me they never clean the filters because nobody ever trained them to do that. Now, I don't know what your house looks like, but we all have to clean. I mean, with the vacuum, you clean your filter in the front of your window unit, your HVAC unit. We do that every year. So what do you think is sitting in those filters in some of those buildings where the HVAC has been there for 4 to 5 years, right? So this is, and it is beyond, at this point, it's beyond funding. I really believe it's like an act of educational apartheid, how they treat the students and teachers in this district. It is almost like they want to send people in those buildings to drop dead. And that is my biggest fear, is that, and I'm also concerned with some of the language of some parents on some of our social media pages who are like, we shouldn't be scared to send our kids to school as if the pandemic is something that we made up. We shouldn't be scared to like figure out some other ways. And I'm not saying that they're not plans in place. Like, there's lots of really good plans in some of our local suburbs that have been posted on their website, where they are talking about taking children outdoors at 10, 15-minute intervals, and how they're talking about doing temperature checks at the school and things like that. There's lots of plans available. And my concern is that the school district constantly puts a blind eye to what it can do. And I'm always concerned because I'm like, you spend a lot of money on contracts and contractors who give you the worst advice and the worst services for the money that they provide. And even some of those big name contracts, what they do is they subcontract the work out to subcontractors who make pennies on the dollar to go visit children at their homes and do case management work, to do special education support services. Like, a lot of those people that they subcontract to, so maybe the contract worth $300,000, $500,000, but they pay people $15, $12, $13 an hour to do those things. And most of those requirements don't require you to have a degree. Well, a degree, but not like a certificate. You don't have to have a degree in the actual services you are providing. So that's something else.
Just a little bit of a different perspective on what Tamara is saying. just keep in mind that over the past, say, like 15, 20 years, the agenda of this school district and school districts across the nation has been one of free market and privatization, and that no matter who the superintendent is, and even disappointingly, that we went from the SRC to the Board of Education, that is still the agenda. As I said, you look at every individual meeting agenda and you will see it. You'll see it in the charter schools, and even though the board has not approved any new charters, they very quietly, surreptitiously, month after month, are approving charters that do not deserve to be renewed. They literally have not met any standards that are still approved. So you have more and more money supporting the free market privatization agenda, and that goes into the outsourcing of services, as Tamara said. And the school's chief financial officer often says, proudly, that we spend so little on the administration. And as we like to remind the board, that's because you outsource so much of that work to outside companies. So maybe it's not in column A, but it is in column B. So we have had this free market privatization agenda. Dr. Haidt himself is a graduate of the Broad Academy. He has carried that on. First thing he did was close 22 neighborhood schools. So that's, you got to, dig down to what Tamara is saying, and the philosophy that comes from, which is still there, and which the board, and again, to sort of repeat what she was saying, is it deliberate or not? We just have not seen that the board has the knowledge of what has happened to schools in the past 20 years to really make a decision. Unfortunately, the one person who seemed to understand that was Dr. McGinley, and he's not on the board anymore. He came up as an educator. So, when we look at all of this, how did we end up where we are? Because the resources went into privatization and into the pockets of consultants and real estate developers who, develop charter schools. That's what we have to turn around.
I feel as though you're both hitting on the kind of two-pronged issue here, which is that it's both a racial issue and an economic issue, and how those things have coalesced over the last 25, 30 years. When we look at, Philadelphia and a number of the urban school districts across this country. And I think, as to your point, Dana, earlier, COVID-19 and everything, the pandemic, as well as the racial injustice issues that we have been particularly acute at this particular moment, really just kind of unveil this kind of underlying set of processes that have been happening for quite some time, to the point that I think in many ways it's become common sense, right? Like, this is the way school districts somehow are. This is the common sense way of managing and engaging families, thinking about, or quote unquote, engaging families. And I think that this has shown us yet again, how we got here. And I think you all have really pointed to that. To kind of continue the conversation, I'm wondering then, this is what we're experiencing right now. And it's clear that there have been at every turn an alternative way. Another set of ways that, as I argue here in introing the show, that are perhaps more just and more centered on safety than what we've gotten so far. And so I wanted to turn it to all of you. And maybe we can start with Dana and Tamara with the Racial Justice Organizing Committee's demands and perspectives, but would love to hear from all four of you around what's the alternative, right? What are some of the other ways that we should be proceeding, not only from the leadership perspective of the district, but I like to think about it as regional, right? How can we regionally coordinate ourselves, and what role do teachers, parents, and students, most importantly, have in reopening schools in as safe and just and fair and equitable way as possible, given the circumstances? But Dana and Tamara, maybe you could start us off with some thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. Tamara is the resident historian, so it is my pleasure for her. It is my pleasure for her to be here. I don't know if you guys know Tamara, but she really is a genius. But the things that you're talking about, like what can we do in terms of racial and social justice in order to transform education? These are the things that the Racial and Social Justice Committee have brought forth to the board in the form of 10 demands. So I guess Tamara and I will go over those demands. But as it relates specifically to what you were saying, we are requesting, and we have requested, I think this was a year ago, or maybe this was just this January, Tamara, where we requested an oversight board for the school.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking that I think that, so something that APS has been doing diligently through the SRC and through now has been this like watchful eye on what has happened, like making sure that information is public, challenging them to be public. I think it has to be taken even one step further, in that if we're going to continue to have a school board that continues to do whatever excuse my French, whatever it just wants to do, there needs to be an oversight committee that includes like community members, parents, retired current educators, students. Like it's almost like the independent oversight committee that we always recommend for the police. I mean, don't get me wrong, it never works because they don't listen to them. But I'm saying that having an oversight committee that basically not just shares information, but literally somewhere, like this is something that could be changed in the mayor's I can't think of the word, in the mayor's charter, right? This is actually a council thing that could be proposed that I've actually been talking with Kendra Brooks about. But this is the thing, is that there needs to be a charter because the mayor appoints the school board. There needs to be a charter where he appoints an oversight committee. And that the oversight committee is vested with some sort of oversight vote. That means that, say for instance, the school board votes anonymously to approve 5 charter schools that haven't done well since Jesus died, right? Then the oversight committee can basically has to be approved by the oversight committee. If it is not, then it can't go through. It's very similar to like the racial equity committees that have been they've been percolating in St. Paul for the last 5 years. And one of those things the racial equity committee's been doing in St. Paul, Minnesota, one is they look at suspensions to make sure that Black and brown children are not suspended at a ridiculous higher rate. And they also oversee teachers. So they're like another checkpoint for teachers in the union. So if they feel like they can't get support here for some harassment or whatever, they can get support from the racial justice. And it's vested, like in their city, it's a part of the teacher contract, and it's also part of their city charter. So something like that, I'm not saying.
You know what, though, Tamara, let me say, you know why we seem to think we need an oversight board? Because in every place else, the voters are the oversight.
Right.
And we are the one district in the entire state of Pennsylvania, not to mention New Jersey, Delaware, everywhere else, that does not have an elected board. So, you know, if they did what they did last week, you know, in an elected district, they go, you know, there might be hell to pay in the next election. But the mayor, we didn't go back to local control. We went back to mayoral control. And the mayor is the only person really that they're truly accountable to, because he appoints them. We don't vote for them. And we shouldn't even have to resort to like oversight committees. In my opinion, that's what city council's for. And one of the things that happened when we went back from the SRC was we gave City Council a little bit of power to at least have a confirmation hearing. Now, unfortunately, they didn't do much with that a few months ago, but that's where we come in as voters to put pressure on them to really look at who's going to be on that board. But, you know, the mayor has a nominating committee, and as soon as they started to meet, the mayor said, okay, they're going to meet in executive session. I mean, it was really complete BS. They're not, it should have all been done in public. We should have been there for all their deliberations. He shut that down completely. So now we're in a space where we say, you know, we need an oversight board. And that gets tricky, you know, because do you want people overturning the decisions of the duly appointed board in this case? Because other people who are organized, let's just say other organizations, other forces who are organized and well-funded will find themselves on that board. So we keep spinning because we're not an elected board.
Right, but I also think too that the oversight committee, just like an elected official, I think it should, like if it's going, that's why I'm talking about in the charter itself, it should be something also that is that cycles out, like cycles every 2 years, so that you don't have the same people in there doing the same thing over and over again. But I also believe that even in elected, like St. Paul does have an elected school board, and they still need a racial equity committee because the school board was still doing like some very like racially questionable things, right? And so, and I also think too, it's something to be said about, like my favorite story of this is when they first wanted to start the school advisory council. So I was in those early meetings, those secret knock meetings before they realized who I was and then stopped inviting me. But that's a whole different story. So then the thing is, while I was there, I remember they were very focused on what happened with local school councils in Chicago. So I became like that source because I was, you know, I'm taught in Chicago. Local school councils are very much, especially now, they're part of the teacher contract and decision-making, things like that. So I was like, you want to give parents that kind of power? I mean, it's a pros and cons, but mostly it's been a positive thing because we also have like professional ethic boards in Chicago. We have professional responsibility things, and all these groups work together to try to come to a decision. Because I'm a firm believer that if you have a lot of heads on something, you get a little more a variety of perspective to consider, and so you go from there. But after the meeting finished and they released the original school advisory council rules, like what they were looking for, in that original document, it said it's going to be very much like the local school council. And then the minute parents started to join and started to question and challenge principals, they went back into the drawing board and they made a whole new ruling for the school advisory council until it was just basically nothing, which it is now. And so, so is that they constantly, like that is something that's constantly missing. But I also want to let Dana get back, because that's like part of the demands is also including more people in the conversation. Like when we're talking about queer students, LGBTQ students, like you actually having consequences for policy 252. Like you actually having policy, like consequences for the harassment policy 248 and 249. I don't know if people realize that the harassment policy, all three of them, all of them except for the LGBTQ policy, the cyberbullying policy and the sexual and racial harassment policy for students still includes the SRC as the governing body. And it's on the webpage. And it hasn't been updated since 2013. So even if I was an attorney representing a teacher who had harassed the student or whatever, I would tear that harassment thing to shreds and be like, it doesn't have any teeth. We also talked about special ed modifications and making sure you have services and making sure people have a full staff, making sure that you're hiring like full-time social workers, things that we're asking for kids to be treated like human beings. And as a result, they're not. And teachers aren't getting the support.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We I just want to make sure we get all of our demands in. So we want pathways for children to be able to go into magnet schools. We want more equitable admissions for magnet schools. I think everyone has heard the horrible stories from the Black Philly Student Speak Instagram page and Black at Mastering. Please check out those pages. We definitely want to uplift the voices of those children. And a part of those demands is they want to make sure that they have support. So we also have culturally responsive curriculum, mandatory anti-racist training for all educators. Mandatory, and I'm going to explain to you why that's so important. You have to understand the school district of Philadelphia, the demographics of the students is about 70% African American and Latino, Black and Latino, and the teachers are about 70% white. That disconnect is creating a huge cultural issue in our school. And I'm not saying that people are inherently racist, but I'm saying that there's a certain bias that comes with you teaching the community that you're not familiar with. So in order for everyone to address those biases and confront their own biases, it is necessary that the school district of Philadelphia teachers go to the anti-racist training. And if anybody thinks that they shouldn't, just go to the Black Philly Student Speaks or the Black at Mastering pages so you can understand how these actions are affecting our children. Of course, we demand non-toxic schools. I mean, that goes without saying. You know, part of our reason as to why the school district can't manage anything having to do with COVID is the fact that they have yet to manage anything having to do with asbestos for the past 8 million years. And they have our students as well as our teachers breathing in cancer air in those buildings. So yes, I already went over the equitable access. We demanded that the school board endorse the Black Lives Matter Week of Action, which they started off that last school board meeting endorsing. That's tomorrow. So eloquently put in her blog post, how can you say that you support Black lives when you have the policies and practices that completely go against the best interest of the students who you say you love? Additionally, we demand, let me explain how important this is really quickly. We demand restorative justice and funding counselors and not cops. We definitely uphold the demand from PSU to get the police out of schools. But I'm going to explain to you why this is so important. And this is just something that happened a couple of days ago at the PSU protest as to why it's important to get the police out of schools. Just the police being there could potentially create an incident. Just the police not being able to control themselves can potentially create an incident. If you go on our Facebook pages, you see me, a kindergarten teacher of 10 years, with a police officer in my face. That's because the police were there at the protest and they were recording the students and we were asking them to stop, and that created a whole incident. So at a student protest where the students are asking for police-free schools, there is a police incident because the police are there violating the rights of these children. They could have had a conversation with us. They didn't have to put hands on the teacher. But at the end of the day, that's what happened. One of the cops pushed the teacher, and then it could have potentially been a tragic situation, all because the cops were there in the first place. So it is so important for the school district of Philadelphia to implement restorative practices throughout the school district of Philadelphia and do it with complete fidelity. Just don't put it on the paper and check it off. And you hire some people from an outside company to say that you're coming in. Please research the boards of the people that the school district of Philadelphia is hiring. They were going to put an equity coordinator from Stepping Stone Foundation into Mastering School as the remedy for their racial justice issues, right? But then when I researched the board of Stepping Stone, you see that they're from Boston and it's an all-white, mostly male board of directors. How are you managing equity in Philadelphia when you're not from here and you guys have no connection to this community? So I just briefly went over all of our demands. You can check them out on the Racial Justice Organizing page on Facebook, Instagram. But yes, We have all those things there to hopefully uplift our students.
Hey, I wanted to hear a little bit, or if we could hear a little bit from you, just some thoughts around both what Dana and Tamara have put out, and the question of moving or reopening the schools more safely.
Well, one of the things that just really, it just disturbed me so greatly to have seen that interaction between Dana and the police officers, when all the teachers were asking is, stop filming our students, their children. And my daughter just moved from Cheltenham, where she could have had her daughter attend school, back into Philadelphia. And my 4-year-old granddaughter is going to be attending the school district for the first time. And my daughter saw that interaction. And so how can you tell us Black Lives Matter and say that to me as a grandmother, or say that to my daughter as a mother, and have that interaction taking place? And I was talking to a friend yesterday and trying to explain to her the interactions between police and children. I had my first year in the district, a school police officer snatched one of my kids out in the hall, threw him to the floor, and handcuffed him, his hands behind his back. This was a 3rd grader. And so you can't tell me that you feel the same way about Black children and white children, or brown children and white children, and have those kinds of things happening in schools. And finally, I spoke to someone who kind of has an in to the school board and their, what I like to call, tomfoolery and shenanigans. And she said that one of the things that we need to do, in addition to having all of these wonderful protests in Philadelphia, we need to also have these protests at the state level. One of the state legislators, I think his last name is Sonny or something like that, had actually said, oh, here comes Philadelphia again asking for more money, and they have all those Black and brown students that can't even learn. I mean, that came out of someone's mouth. And so how do you expect anything, even at a local level, to happen when that's what's happening at the state level? There are apparently 9 House members and 3 Senate members at the state level that need to be flipped. We need to get rid of them in order to have any hope of having justice, because everything gets voted on at that state level. All of the funds get dispersed from there. That's where we have to put more of our focus, keep the steam on in the city as well, but we have to have that additional focus there. And there's a Martina White, I think is her name, in the Northeast or something. She needs to go. We need to focus our efforts on that. We need to get a lot more grassroots politicians in. As you can see from what just happened with Alexandria Ortiz-Cortez, that was power. Everything is being unveiled now. We're at a crucial moment where the government is making it very clear we don't care about these Black and brown bodies that feed us, take care of our children, come and make money for our corporations. They've made it very clear, because the meatpacking plants, oh, go back to work anyway. And they have all those when feasible clauses added into CDC directions to say, we don't care if you get sick. Amazon even, that they fired a man who was just trying to organize to keep people safe. And Jeff Bezos never got back to me. Their attorney, I forget his name, the one that made the statement about him being inarticulate and ignorant, whatever, never got back to me. They don't care. We have to make them care. And that's only done through politics.
In this closing few minutes that we have here, I think you've all pointed to both, I think, importantly, the long game, the kind of long march to freedom that we need to be engaged in. And so to close, actually, I'm thinking about the short game here. What are some of the immediate things that we need to be doing with regards to what the district is doing with regards to reopening the schools, and how they, these short game strategies map onto the longer game? I know, for example, like the internet and providing Wi-Fi for everyone. I know perhaps maybe we could start there. I know, Lisa, you might have had some thoughts on that.
Yeah.
What do we need to do?
I'm going to ask the same question I've been asking in my testimony at the board and on social media. If families have to pay for a service in order for their children to attend school, do we still have a system of free public education? And now that we're going to all virtual, at least for the first few months, that is a very important question. And we've heard people talk about hotspots and internet essentials and things. We need every single family to have adequate service. And we need that to be either free or affordable, because you cannot have children who are already having challenges say, well, sorry, or, go park yourself at a parking lot so you can get internet in the middle of winter when it's raining. So the mayor has to talk to Comcast, who has benefited from, I could not give you a number, many, many, many dollars in tax abatements and tax cuts. They have benefited from being in the city. And we have to make sure that the business community doesn't just talk about, oh, we're partners. This is dire now. We have to make sure that Comcast and Verizon do what they have to do to make sure our kids can attend school. And that has to come from the mayor's office and from city council to say to them, we need to decide right now that we have maybe a month left, how every child is going to have internet service, adequate service.
Beyond the internet, what else should we be thinking about?
I definitely.
Now, I'm just gonna say really quick, we need to really think too about next year's game plan for the local and state elections. We have a lot of people representing us in the educational committee who don't have our best interests at heart. I'm not gonna name any names. I named them in the chat, but they need to go. And they have, Chris Rabb talks about it all the time. And I feel like he's out there literally like banging a plate out in Harrisburg by himself sometimes. It needs to be, we have an opportunity to really get a lot of more grassroots people in Harrisburg right now, and to push a lot of people out of that have been there forever. And we also need to like make sure that we are providing some sort of civic education for our new 18-year-olds that are about to vote too. And for some of our people that have been voting forever and don't know what's going on. Like that needs to happen too. Sorry. Go ahead, Dana.
Oh, I was just going to say, in terms of our families, some of our families are non-traditional families, and the students are being raised by grandparents, perhaps foster parents, perhaps an older relative that's not really tech savvy. So what I would love for the family, for the school district, family and community engagement office, the FACE office, or somebody between now and August, you need to reach out to those families. You need to create a little one-stepper or a little tutorial about how to access the learning, because you have people who just don't know how to do it. So that is an immediate concern that I have. We need to first make sure that everybody has internet access. We need to make sure that everybody knows how to access the learning. And we need to make sure that the students and the parents have the proper facilities at home in order to make sure that the children can learn as much as possible.
we have just like maybe 2 minutes, but you know, there's been all this talk around these learning pods and the inequities that are reemerging through these kind of learning pods where parents and families are trying to kind of supplement or replace education, and in some ways step away from the public school system in order to educate their kids. I was wondering, is there a space for learning pods within the model, or if there is, like, what should that look like? At least from a district perspective, is there a way to support some of that so that it is more equitable? I wondered if anyone had thoughts on that.
I definitely think the learning pods come from a position of privilege for people who are able to do that for their families. At the same time, you do have families who can't afford that, who really don't know what to do in terms of this upcoming virtual school year. I do believe that the School District of Philadelphia, in addition to other state and local programs, need to provide a virtual learning space for children and families who don't either have access to the learning at home, or because of the family situation, they can't access learning. For example, I believe in Houston, there is the YMCA, the YWCA, and they open specific areas just for learning. There are only a specific number of children. They have everything, you know, regulated, hopefully up into their own guidelines and not CDC, because they keep changing. But they made the space available to assist the children who can't access virtual learning at home, or parents may not be able to provide that space. At this time, I mean, come on, we have about 5 or 6 weeks. There is enough time for some elected officials, the Mayor's Office of Education, as well as the School District of Philadelphia, to identify some spaces. May it be libraries, it might be religious spaces that they can partner with, but they need some spaces in the city for these parents and these students who aren't going to be able to access learning at home. So I believe that is an immediate concern that the community can address, especially for those parents who can't afford learning pods.
Kate, did you have some thoughts on students with disabilities or exceptional or non-typical students?
Well, the other thing is that we're going to have to address those students even now as we go back virtually, because there are blind students that will not be able to access virtual learning. There are other students, autistic students, students with other exceptionalities that are not going to be able to learn through the virtual model. And while these schools are empty and being cleaned, because we do expect that to happen, but the schools can even be places, they have the internet, they have the infrastructure, they can even be used as those spaces until we're able to come back fully as a face-to-face teaching community. But there are a lot of things that have to be addressed around a virtual learning space that the school board has not taken advantage of. And all of this time that we have been out of school due to this pandemic, that's what they should have been doing. And if they were genuine about student safety and success, that's what they would have been doing, instead of trying to force everyone back in. I forget who said it. I think it was you, Lisa. Government by Sharpie. Can't have that.
We're basically out of time, but I wanted to ask for our audience members, how can they get involved right now? What's next in terms of the organizing around reopening the schools in as safe a just way as possible?
I would say get involved with the Racial Justice Organizing Committee. And where APS comes in, as Tamara mentioned before, is we're the eyes and the ears, and we actually put out reports called Eyes on the SRC to talk about how they're spending money. Ears on the Board of Education to say, this is what happened, this committee meeting, the Finance Committee meeting, the action meeting, this is how they voted on. So I think what we do is we show up at everything, and we write about it But I think in terms of action, I think there's our city, our schools, and there's the Racial Justice Organizing Committee.
Dana, Tamara, is there a way for people to get connected with the Racial Justice Organizing Committee, since we have you here?
Yes. And actually, the best way is because Facebook, I know it's like MySpace for young people, but you could go to our Facebook page, the Black Lives Matter Philly Facebook page. You can also go to the Racial Justice Organizing Facebook page. You can also go to sites.google.com/racial justice organizing. And you will find us there, and we can add you to our listserv. You can find meetings there. One thing that is there that I think is also very important is we have this ongoing COVID resource guide that we update every week to let people know about issues of unemployment, issues of Comcast, issues of SEPTA. Like, we put all those things. We even include sanitation links up there. We also include I almost forgot. Well, we also include we also include mental health resources for the community and for kids. And Dana also has another group too, the Parents Organizer. I'm gonna let her say it because she.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I have a group on Facebook, again, for all of us archaic individuals. The name of it is Parents Organized for a Better School District of Philadelphia. The Racial Justice Committee also has another effort, the Committee to Rename Philadelphia Streets and Schools. That's another thing that we're doing in order to uplift racial and social justice in Philadelphia. So you can find us anywhere. Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, we are out of time. I'm Edwin Mayorga. I want to thank my guests, Tamara Anderson, Dana Carter, Lisa Haver, Kate Sannicks-Lerner. I also want to thank our studio engineer, Dylan De Rosato, for helping us today. Thank you for listening to Encuentros Políticos, Political Encounters on USALA Radio. If you have comments or questions about the show, you can find me on Twitter at EIMayorga or email at edwin.mayorga@gmail.com. Join us on Sundays at 5 p.m. Eastern on usalamedia.com or download the podcast on Spreaker. Thank you. Valente. Thank you, everyone.